talk that I wanted to give last week when we were interrupted by events, overtaken by events in Louisiana, Minnesota, and Texas, which seemed to really scream for our attention. Of course, now this week, I no sooner get this thing tweaked and put back together, and then I think it was on Thursday we have the events in France. And I understand there was an attempted coup in Turkey. That's in a different category. That's someplace over here because they've been doing that forever in Turkey. This is coup attempt or coup number 6 since 1960. It's in a little different category, but we have the situation in France. And now, some of you were driving up here this morning. I don't know if you heard the news this morning, but I'm just going to mention that there are reports that there were 3 police officers in Baton Rouge who were killed this morning. And I always say you got to be careful about the information that you get within 12 hours of an event because they really don't know a lot yet. So they really don't know a lot yet, except that 3 were killed and others were wounded. So we're going to deal with that this morning because we have to get at the root cause of all this stuff that's going on. And of course, you know what I'm going to say, it all starts in consciousness, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning. We have to find a way to get ourselves into a state of consciousness that is not so reactive. It's not so reactive. So I'm going to forge ahead this morning because I'll tell you, if things keep going like this, we're going to run out of space on this wall over here before too long. I hate to think of that, but what I wanted to talk about last week, I wanted to focus on the good. I wanted to focus on what was right in this country, what was going good in this country. I was inspired by something that happened on July 4th, Monday, July 4th. You all might recall, NASA put a spacecraft in orbit around Jupiter. They timed it so that what happened on the 4th of July. And there was something about that I found to be really truly, sincerely patriotic. That captured the best of what our country can stand for in the world. Peaceful exploration because we're curious, because we want to know. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge. No gaining motive. We're not going to Jupiter to try to suck oil out of the atmosphere or bring diamonds back to this country. We're not going to take anything from Jupiter except photos and terabytes of data, and in the process, maybe learn something about how our solar system and the Earth were formed, how they came into being. That's the kind of leadership in the world that I can really support and get behind. Now, this was an expensive mission, as we might imagine, but we really can't put a price on it because one of the things that we've learned over the years is that this kind of mission produces incidental and unexpected contributions that really do benefit the world in concrete and practical ways. Back in the early 1900s, when rocket technology was just being developed, people looked at that and said, what a silly waste of money. What are you going to do with that? Besides shoot skyrockets into the air for fireworks and things like that. And then all of a sudden we were putting communication satellites into orbit. And people began to think, maybe this isn't so stupid after all. Now we have GPS satellites and all the other things that are happening. That time in the 50s and the 60s produced a generation of scientists and engineers who made this country a world leader in the field of innovation and technology. Monday, July 4th, I'm sitting outside my backyard by the pond with my iPad and a cigar and an adult beverage, and I brought up the NASA website on my iPad using a link to my cell phone to watch live coverage on NASA TV as this spacecraft started orbiting the planet Jupiter. In my backyard on a device I can hold in one hand with a really, really good picture. They were showing the Jet Propulsion Laboratory just down the way here in Pasadena. They were tracking the last 30 minutes of the orbital insertion maneuver, I think they called it. And they were doing this mini documentary telling us all about the mission from start to finish. And the clock is counting down. Now, a mere 10 years ago, I couldn't do that. which is hard to believe. I looked this up and I thought, my goodness, 2006, 10 years ago, there were no smartphones. The first iPhone came out in 2007. The iPad didn't come along until 2010. But today I can watch this live, and when the countdown was over, I think we have a picture here. Oh, there it is. There's the mission, and here's the next one. This is what happened, of course, when the countdown was finished. Everybody was cheering. Got to watch it happening in real time. They were cheering because everything had gone almost perfectly. I say almost because after traveling a mere 1.7 billion miles, that's billion with a B, it was late in arriving by 1 second. Incredible. So after that, the program was over. They signed off, and I got up and I looked at the night sky, and I was wondering where Jupiter was. And as they say, there's an app for that. Also on my iPad, I called that up. Hold the screen up to the sky. It will tell you where everything is. You point it at the sky, it tracks everything, tells you where it is. There was Jupiter. There was the second brightest thing in the sky after Mars, which it showed me over here, and Saturn, which was over there. I'm looking at this bright light in the sky, knowing that we had just parked a spacecraft in orbit around it. Now I say we because this was a collective accomplishment, and I don't think anyone in the control room at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory would disagree with me about this. It's kind of like what Neil Armstrong said when he stepped on the moon back in 1969. He said, "This is one small step for a man, one giant leap for humankind." It was a collective accomplishment. For me, being a witness to the events on July 4th and back in 1969 for the moon landing, those were what I call spiritual experiences. For me, it's the very definition of spiritual, being able to see and to appreciate how the tangible and the intangible aspects of reality, and remember, I define spirituality or the spiritual as the intangible side of reality. Tangible and intangible work together to do awe-inspiring things. Yes, there's technology, there's engineering, there's lots of moving parts that go into all of that, but there's also an intangible aspect of consciousness that's just as important. Same thing is true for music and the other arts. We're moved by something which is the product of the physical and the non-physical coming together in ways that are greater than merely the sum total of their parts. There has to be a collective human consciousness that creates the conditions and the environment to support what it takes for all of that to happen. That's the spiritual aspect. Now, down in Pasadena, those are some seriously smart and talented people who made all of that happen. The results speak for themselves, and they're just as much an outpicturing of consciousness as are the nuts and bolts and computers that make it all possible. But lately, I've been watching something happen to that kind of expression of consciousness, that expression of consciousness that says that we want to create beautiful things, we want to learn things, we want to figure out our world and forge ahead. There's been something happening to that expression of consciousness. And I'm not just talking about the violence that's been going on in the world. I think they have the same root cause. But there's also been this insidious and subversive anti-intellectual and anti-scientific mindset that's creeping into our culture, not just here, but all around the world. Juno arrived at Jupiter on Monday, July 4th. On July 7th, in Williamstown, Kentucky, America's newest theme park opened. It's called Ark Encounter. Have you heard of it? Yeah. It's called Ark Encounter, as in Noah's Ark. Now, this was brought to us by the same guy who gave us the Creation Museum. That's Ken Ham. He's what's known as a young Earth creationist, which means that he truly believes, and thinks everyone else should too, he truly believes that creation happened exactly as depicted in the book of Genesis. 6 24-hour days, human beings were created just the way we are right now, sometime about 6,000 years ago. Evolution is a lie from the pit of hell, and Satan created the fossil record just to deceive us into believing that the Bible isn't totally, completely, 100% accurate and true. His creation museum cost $27 million. It has exhibits showing human beings and dinosaurs living together, because apparently there's something in the Bible which says that human beings and dinosaurs live together. So, now he has the Ark Encounter, complete with an ark built to the specifications in Genesis, complete with stuffed animals and cages, including dinosaurs, of course. The Ark Encounter cost $102 million. $43 million of that was in taxpayer-funded subsidies, which is another big problem and an issue for another day. Might explain why they picked Kentucky to build it in, though, because you've heard the term the Bible Belt. A lot of people consider Kentucky to be the buckle in the Bible Belt. So they could get away with that there. And of course, Ken Ham is encouraging public schools now to start organizing field trips. Of course, bring them to the Ark Encounter so the kids can be educated in what history is really all about, instead of what those pointy-headed intellectuals and scientists want to feed them in school. All of those fools with their fossil record, carbon dating, astronomy, and geology, what do they know? How dare they contradict my holy book and my religious beliefs? And in fact, when you go into the Ark Encounter, this is one of the signs that you're greeted with. It's a sign with the serpent, the snake from Genesis, crawling around it. And the sign says, if I can convince you that the flood was not real, then I can convince you that heaven and hell are not real. That's the agenda. That's the mission. My Bible is superior to your knowledge, and the evidence be damned. The Bible is their authority. No evidence to the contrary is going to convince them that they might be wrong, and public funds help to build it. Now, let's consider what the Noah and the Ark story is all about. If you start out over at the Creation Museum, down the road, it talks about how in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, God creates the world and everything in it and calls it good, right? And God said that it was good. All the way through. It's good, it's good, it's good. It's all good. Then we get down to the Ark Encounter, and we hear the Noah story, and all of a sudden this world that he created is not so good anymore. In fact, it's so bad that God wants to destroy it and kill every living thing on the planet except Noah and his family. Now that creates some theological problems if you're of a theological bent, because, you know, we say, or they say, that God is all-knowing, right? Or God is all-powerful. If God is all-knowing, didn't God see this coming? The world is good, now the world is bad. Was God wrong, or did God see it coming and just decided to go along with the kabuki theater? I mean, that's one of the conclusions that you come to. So, if things were so bad, whose fault was it? And then, consider this. What would we call someone today who decided to kill thousands of people to cause fear and to scare people into obedience? Dare I say terrorist? Would that be too strong of a word? And they just built a monument to that in Kentucky. A theme park, for crying out loud. Where is one of the places that real world terrorists get their inspiration? One of them is their holy books, right? It's more complicated than just that, but one of the places are the holy books. Whether they're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, they look to their holy books and they're trying to get back to what they consider to be a more pure version of their religion and their scriptures. Their religion and their scriptures. They hate the modern world and the way things are changing because it calls into, every time we discover something new and expand our knowledge, it calls into question their religious beliefs. And do they feel threatened? Ken Wilber wrote a book called Integral Spirituality, where he talks about this problem. He talks about the level of consciousness that most terrorists are operating at. And at that level of consciousness, they look at the world and they tell themselves a story about it. They tell a story that goes like this. The modern world will not make room for my sacred beliefs, and therefore I am going to blow up that world every chance I get, in God's name and with His blessings. Those whom I kill have in every way brought this on themselves, which is why my acts are not murder, not wrong, not punishable. In fact, they think they'll be rewarded in paradise or heaven or wherever if they do what they do, because of what it says in their holy books or in the interpretation of that holy book presented by someone who has put themselves into a position of authority. The authority looks at the holy book and says, listen to me, I'll tell you what it really, really means. That's what happens. I'll be rewarded if I do this. I'm going to blow up the world every chance I get. They want to drag us back into the Dark Ages, back to a time when religious authorities were the ones who were the absolute rulers. Heretics were burned at the stake. Those were the good old days, according to them, back when religion was pure. Well, there are lots of ways to blow up the modern world. Violent terrorism is one way. The other ways aren't always so easy to spot. I just mentioned that there's something insidious and subversive going on. And this isn't some conspiracy theory, but I've had the sneaking suspicion for a few years now that our primary and secondary education systems are being slowly and systematically dismantled. We've stopped teaching our children how to think critically, how to create, how to build, how to innovate, how to question authority. And our higher education system, which you would think would be kind of a backup, well heck, you're not going to get to the higher education system if the primary and secondary is broke, but it's becoming unaffordable unless you want to incur lifelong debt. It's almost as if we were being programmed to not think for ourselves, but to go back to the days when people were told what to think by people in positions of authority who had figured out basically how to manipulate our emotions. They sometimes call this the dumbing down of America, right? There's more than one way to blow up the modern world, and they don't always involve bombs. Carl Sagan kind of had this figured out many years ago. He died in 1996, but shortly before he died, he wrote a book called The Demon-Haunted World. And here's an early warning we get from Carl Sagan. He says, one of the saddest lessons of history is this. If we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back. Well, there are charlatans already in positions of authority. There are more waiting in the wings. There are charlatans behind the scenes that are providing the funding and pulling the strings. And guess who let it happen? Guess who let it happen? It happened on our watch. And I fear that the next generation will not think kindly of us. So, a couple of weeks ago, when we started this series on July 3rd, I ended with some questions. I asked, how free do we really want to be? Are we willing to look at where we might still be slaves to ideology, to identity politics, to superstition, rather than using our precious gift of reason and logic to deal with difficult issues. Because when reason and logic go out the window, violence becomes acceptable. That's how religion works. Religion's figured out a long time ago how to appeal to that unevolved part of our brain that we sometimes call the reptilian brain, the part of the brain that is easily manipulated through fear and our emotions. Religion figured it out, and now people in the secular world have figured out how to do the same thing. It all calls for a spiritual solution. It all starts with consciousness, individual and then collective. As always, the first step is self-awareness. The first authority we question is within us. What is it that I claim to know with absolute certainty? Is it really knowledge? Or is it part of some ideology that I've been immersed in since childhood? Am I really thinking for myself? Or am I just repeating the stuff that I've been told to think by others? Have I been manipulated and bamboozled by one of those charlatans that Carl Sagan was talking about? Have I given my power away? It takes courage to do that. It takes even more courage to admit that, yeah, that might have happened. It takes courage to admit it, but it's an essential first step on the road back to real freedom. The way you know real freedom, and the way we can see and understand and identify collective consciousness based on real freedom, is because it delivers the goods. That's the kind of consciousness that made it possible for humankind to eradicate polio, land on the moon, to stop HIV from being a death sentence, to put a spacecraft in orbit around Jupiter, and all sorts of things. I could write a list that's a mile long about the kind of things that that consciousness creates. It delivers the goods. The opposite of that is a collective consciousness that wants to blow things up, either physically, or to kill people, or to urge us to stop, to go backwards, to stop thinking for ourselves, and to listen to an authority and give our power away. That's the stark choice. We say our mission each week. We have a positive message that we're advancing. A part of that positive message in unity is that we can see, resist, and reverse that kind of thinking if we're willing to practice what we preach and remember that it all begins with me. We're going to be doing this song here shortly talking about all the stuff that begins with me. That's the work we have to do. And that's why it's so important to start at the basis of what we think and what we do. And then we go out into the world and we act as examples. And we reverse and we resist. So, as I keep saying each week, we've got our work cut out for us. Come on back next week and we'll take it a little deeper. See you then.